First, let's look at this map showing population data based off of the 2022 census. You can see which states have more and less people, and a bar graph showing state population in descending order. This data is what we're going to use to do our voting analysis. Now let's look at presidential voting power by state. I'm in California, so we're going to look at voting power California compared to other states. If we take the Electoral College votes of California, divide by the population, and do the same for Kansas, we can see that a resident of Kansas has 1.5 times the votes of somebody in California, and somebody in Texas actually has 90% of the vote relative to somebody in California. If you look at a state like Wyoming, somebody has 3.5 times plus the votes compared to somebody in California. Another way to visualize this data is by looking at averages. If we do that same calculation for each state and divide it against every other state and divide it by 50, then we can see the voting power per state on average. So as we see here, states with fewer people tend to have a higher voting power than states with less people. If we look at Wyoming, on average, an individual in Wyoming has 2.7 votes compared to an individual selected from another random state. We can see the calculation here showing the summation divided by 50, the previous equation we saw in the last video. Now, one thing to note here is if we compare this map to the state population map, you see that it looks like an inverse. So the states where you see a lot of red on this map are the states where you don't see much red on the state population map. Next, let's look at the Congress. So if we select California again, we can select another state and see the relative votes. Things are a little bit more even in the Congress, and it's important to look at the range on each of these maps to see the difference. So in this case, let's choose another state to compare from, say Wyoming. And you can see somebody in California is 80% or 70% Texas versus Wyoming. But things are a little bit more even. If we look at the congressional averages, then they're what we expect. Not quite as many outliers as we see in the presidential averages. Now, if we zoom in here, note that one area being left out of this equation is Washington, D.C., as they do not have the same congressional representation as other states, given that it's not, at least yet, a state as of 2024. And that's factored into that summation. Okay, so now let's look at a little bit more exciting map, the Senate map, and we're going to actually hit the reset button here. And I've been selecting California, so let's select a different state to compare from, Texas. And as we know, every state has 2 senators, so you can see that the states with fewer people have a much higher level of representation per person than the states with large populations. So one way to think about this is if a resident of Texas, if a senator in Texas is representing 20 people, then a senator in New Hampshire is representing 1 person. Or if a senator in Texas is representing 100 people, a senator in New Hampshire is representing 5 people. So how much say you have in the Senate is highly influenced by how many people there are in your state. This might seem obvious, but we start seeing some pretty big numbers when we go to a place like Montana here. Compared to California, 2% compared to Montana. North Dakota is one of the few that actually is on par. So 3% in Texas. I'm sorry, 4% rounded. So let's go back to another big state, California. Now, let's do the same comparison of this map compared to the state population map. And you can see once again, it looks like an inverse. Wrapping things up here, let's look at the same Senate mean, doing the same calculations that we did for Congress and President. And here again, you can see that inverse from the state population map and the states with very high levels of voting power are the states with very low populations. And this stands to reason. It's worth noting when some states have almost 2 orders of magnitude higher representation per individual. There's something going on here. So hopefully this will be a tool to help other people just gauge their individual voting power compared to others in this election and both the federal and congressional elections for the House of Representatives. And will be a good learning tool to put things in perspective and something we can come back to in later years and see how it looks. Thanks for listening.